Good morning in Boston, good evening in Japan, Korea, Singapore, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Christina Davis. I'm professor of government and director of the program on US-Japan relations, and a very proud member of the cohort of former students of Susan Pharr. We're here today to celebrate Susan Pharr's retirement, and I am very happy to invite you to join us for a day of intellectual enjoyment for a symposium, Japan in the World. We're going to begin with a few introductory comments, and then we will shift to engage in the intellectual discussion of many of the themes that have been important in Susan's teaching and research, starting with a panel on economic and social transformation and advanced capitalism. After lunch, moving on to Japan's democratic governance institutions and civil society, and a panel on Japan and international relations, before the highlight of the entire day, of course, which will be closing remarks by Susan Pharr. We all wish we were in person at the Harvard Faculty Club or Susan's garden party, and yet the advantage of being here together on Zoom is, of course, that we can join together with friends from Japan and all over the world, because the fans and friends of Susan Pharr are many and spread out everywhere. So let us enjoy this day together. And I would like to remind you of the Zoom etiquette, as you are all familiar with. We are asking that, since this is a special event, we are all friends, it would be really nice to see your faces. So if you're able to, please do leave your camera on. And yet, unless you are speaking, please keep your microphone off. During Q&A, you'll have an opportunity to raise a question in the chat with a raised hand. And we're going to have this recorded, so we'll have it only in speaker view. We ask that you respect the privacy of other viewers. Now let us begin. I will begin first with a few comments before passing on to others. It is really wonderful to be here today to celebrate the accomplishments of Susan Pharr on the occasion of her retirement. Susan is the Edwin O. Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics. She has taught at Harvard since 1987, and over the years has received many accolades for her service as a leading scholar of Japan, the former chair of the Department of Government, former director of the Reischauer Institute, longtime director of the program on US-Japan relations. There is no better way to celebrate Susan than a symposium that features her students' research on Japan. For Susan has been a great scholar and teacher who has raised a generation of students whose research builds on what we have all learned from her. As an expert on Japanese politics, she taught us how to look more closely into social phenomena, to see that Japan was so much more than an economic miracle or a stagnant economy in decline. At a time now when inequality and social protests loom large around the world, we would benefit from revisiting her 1990 book, Losing Face: Status Politics in Japan, where she shows the logic whereby sometimes groups use weakness to appeal for help, and analyzes the conditions that may lead authorities to offer concessions to resolve social conflict. Susan's approach to research has always been eclectic, open to different theoretical perspectives. From her first book on Japanese political women that drew on interviews of over 100 Japanese women's firsthand accounts of their own experience as participants in politics, to her analysis of focus group surveys on trust in government, her extensive analysis of the multitude of civic society organizations in Japan, Susan embraces research that probes deeply into how people think and the ways in which organizations function in society. Susan also knows the value of a good analogy to clarify the essence of complex political processes. Let me share with you one of my favorites. In an insightful look at Japanese foreign policy as defensive driving, Susan countered the widely held view of Japanese foreign policy as passive and reactive by showing the purposeful direction in which Japan navigates demands for burden sharing in the US-Japan alliance. Her point holds true for what we have observed in the past 4 years of Japan handling the relationship with Donald Trump to avoid a head-on collision while advancing the key interests of Japan. Susan has taught her students to pursue comparative research with attention to local context and big questions, as she always did in her own research. Having worked in government once as the senior social scientist of the Agency for International Development, Susan values research that is policy relevant and has spent decades of service helping Japanese practitioners, journalists, businessmen, bureaucrats in the Japanese government, as they learn to engage in research as visitors at Harvard. You are going to see displayed in the panels today an incredible range of topics, theories, and methods, which is a testament to Susan's philosophy as an advisor. Susan did not produce clones of her own work or fighters in the dogmatic rivalries of the discipline. She provided students with a foundation of training in political science they could take in many different directions. Of course, we know that Susan's role has been so much more than teaching knowledge, as she shows true dedication to support the personal happiness and professional success of her students. And her students are far more in number than those who sat in her classrooms. For everyone who came into the sphere of Susan Pharr became her advisee. Susan has mentored students, visitors, and colleagues at Harvard and beyond Harvard's gates to support a worldwide network of individuals. Before concluding, I have some advice for Susan. As way background, I should note Susan has been advising me for 30 years now, since 1991, when I first took a class from her as an undergraduate at Harvard. She advised my thesis, my doctoral dissertation, and now is guiding me as I try to succeed her as director of the program on US-Japan relations. So I've decided now it's my turn to give her a little bit of advice. Susan, please turn your skills at engaging students in seminars to now enjoy concert performances, World Heritage sites, as you focus on your own love of music and travel. Take your ability to organize meetings to instead plan full days of reading, writing, and gardening without asking anyone to second the minutes or vote on decision items. But please, do not stop advising your students. We will always be looking to you for advice. Thank you so very much, Susan. We look forward to spending the day together with you. Now I would like to pass over to Professor Jeffry Frieden, the chair of the Department of Government, who is going to share his remarks in honor of your longtime service to the department.
Thank you, Christina. It's a great privilege and honor to be here to honor Susan Pharr. As I think most of you know, Susan has been an important, I would say almost an essential member of the Department of Government since she first joined Harvard in 1987, which was almost 35 years ago. Susan served as department chair from 1992 to 1995. In her time as department chair, she had many achievements and made only one serious mistake, which was hiring me. But Susan did go on after being department chair to serve as associate dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for 3 years after that. And as all of you know, she's run the Reischauer Institute and, of course, for many years has been the mainstay of the US-Japan program at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. So Susan has made many important administrative contributions to Harvard, to the Department of Government, and to the study of East Asia and Japan. But perhaps more important, Susan has been central to the intellectual life and scholarly development of the Department of Government, of the social sciences at Harvard more generally, as well naturally to the study of Japan. And you'll be hearing, of course, about the fruits of her intellectual and academic leadership over the course of the day. I have to say, though, as a member of the government department, that one of the most impressive things about Susan is how important she has been as a leader in the department and the university more generally on a wide variety of issues, especially in making both the department and the university more sensitive to the need for greater gender diversity as well as diversity on other dimensions. In my time as chair, I know, and Susan can attest to this, that I have bothered her often, and she has been a constant source of wise counsel and advice through some very difficult times. She has been, in my view, and this is one of the highest pieces of praise I can give to people whom I ask for advice, both sensitive and sensible. So I've relied on her often to try to help us through these, especially this past difficult year and a half. Now, I cannot help from mentioning one of the things that I find most impressive about Susan Pharr. In 2008, the Japanese government awarded Susan the Order of the Rising Sun, gold rays with neck ribbon, in recognition of her contribution, and this is quoting from the recognition, the contribution to promoting intellectual exchange between Japan and the United States of America, and to guiding and nurturing young Japanologists. I think we can all agree with that. And I have to say that I was so impressed by this award that I can't help but share what it looks like, which is that. Of all the things that Susan's done, I'm impressed by many of them, most of them, but that award, I don't know, it's hard to top. In any event, I did want to simply recognize that we hear from the department, from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, from the university, and really from the broader community of scholars. We may not be able to match the magnificence of that award, but I can assure you that we are second to none in our gratitude to Susan for decades and decades of extraordinary dedication, extraordinary achievements, and extraordinary service. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your remarks. And now, Mary Brinton, Reischauer Institute Professor of Sociology and Director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, would like to make a few comments.
Thank you, Christina. Today, we celebrate Susan as an intellectual, a scholar, a mentor, a colleague, and a leader. My brief remarks will center in particular on her leadership in Japanese studies, most especially at Harvard. When I stepped into the role of Reischauer Institute Director a few years ago, I knew I had big shoes to fill. The shoes of Andy Gordon, the shoes of Helen Hardacre, and the shoes of Susan Pharr. Now, in some respects, I knew that would not be so difficult because one of the many things Susan and I have bonded over during the years we've known each other is our sense of style, including what we wear. However, the thought of filling Susan's shoes was nevertheless extremely intimidating. Susan served as the Reischauer Institute Director from 2004 to 2011. And yes, that included the vote of no confidence in Larry Summers in 2005, the financial crisis of 2008, and other minor incidents. I was fairly new at Harvard when Susan began her directorship, and I spent a lot of time in sociological study of my colleagues in sociology. But I soon turned my attention to trying to understand the members of my other tribe at Harvard, Japanese studies, and most of all, the leader of that tribe, Susan Pharr. This too proved to be a formidable task, but I wanted to offer a few comments that are the result of my findings of my participant observation research over the years of Susan as a leader and colleague. Upon first encounter, Susan can strike one as a rather formal person. Raised in the South, I believe, she displays the courtesy, grace, and warmth of people native to that region in the US. Her leadership style is marked by impeccable organization, thorough comprehension of the facts at hand and the current circumstances, read the 2008 financial crisis and its implications for the International Studies Centers at Harvard. Attention to detail, a keen sense of strategy, and last but not least, mastery of the countless facets of Japanese culture that all members of her tribe would do well to comprehend. And I'll mention just a few of those: nemawashi and the distinction between honne and tatemae. For the participants today who are not in Japanese studies, allow me to offer a very brief explanation of these two concepts. Nemawashi is literally the wrapping together of the roots and is an essential feature of Japanese decision-making, i.e. reaching consensus, usually universal consensus. The best leaders skillfully employ nemawashi prior to formal meetings, in our case, meetings of the executive committee of the Reischauer Institute, populated by tenured professors in Japanese studies at Harvard. Meetings led by Susan have been a sight to behold and are a true testament to her skill as a leader. Discussions are skillfully led. Faculty members freely but politely express their views and discuss them. Decisions, nearly always unanimous, are reached in a timely fashion. And let me repeat that for emphasis. Decisions are reached in a timely fashion. In that sense, our meetings are most certainly unlike most meetings in Japan. A study of Susan's leadership reveals the importance of her skillful use of nemawashi and the honne tatemae distinction. When I think of discussions with Susan prior to a formal meeting where we will need to make important decisions, this is what comes to mind. She politely solicits your opinion and proceeds to patiently listen to the rationale you offer. Then, oftentimes, she quietly says, "But don't you think it would also be important for us to consider?" And goes on. By the time the conversation has ended, she's got you. That is not to say she hasn't listened to you and absorbed your viewpoint. She has. But as with any skillful leader, Susan knows how to respectfully raise the points you may be overlooking while also incorporating the logic and emotions of your position into her thinking. Susan's intimate comprehension of honne and tatemae is similar. Tatemae is the surface of things, or what appears to be going on in the situation. Honne is what is underneath, the real crux of the matter. A skillful leader like Susan has a keen sense of both. This is reflected in her knowledge that so-and-so might object to the idea that, on and on. I've thought about that. We will see whether or not it comes up, and we will be prepared for it if it does. That is, the skillful leader leads a meeting with the tatemae in full cognizance of the honne, or sometimes inconvenient, heart of the matter, incorporating the honne into consensual decision-making with the skill of a bunraku puppeteer. In closing, my participant observation study of Susan's leadership over the years has yielded the following conclusions, supported by abundant evidence. Susan has led with grace, with the courage of her convictions, with complete dedication to the constituency and the unit she is representing, and always with a twinkle in her eye.
Thank you very much, Mary, for those kind remarks. I'm very happy that we could have this chance to offer tribute to Susan. And now I'd like to invite us to shift to the start of our symposium, where we will be honoring Susan. I think the hardest thing for her is going to be to remain silent until she gets to offer wrap-up remarks at the end of the day. Although I think she is prompted to ask questions for each panel by her former students. So we're all ready for her to show her perceptive insight. The first panel that we're going to begin is chaired by Professor Hirotaka Takeuchi, who's Professor of Management and Practice of the Strategy Unit at Harvard Business School, along with being the chair of the International Christian University Board of Trustees. He is actually joining us from Tokyo, where he is currently resident. And Hiro is also, of course, the author of an incredible number of articles and books, most recently, The Wise Company. We're very happy he will be chairing the panel, and he will be introducing our speakers and guiding the events. So let me pass it on over to you.
Thank you, Christina. So I am one of the Japanologists that was mentioned earlier, but I reside, as you say, across the river. on the Boston side. So if you're standing at the middle of the bridge facing Boston, Harvard University is geographically and philosophically to the left. And the Harvard Business School is geographically and philosophically to the right. But thanks to Susan, the bridges have united. So I'm very grateful to you for spending 20 minutes one way to go to the gym right next to the Kennedy School every day. That's 20 minutes one way, 40 minutes back and forth, right? To kind of do the fusion of the left and the right. And also, I'm really grateful to you for having invited so many of my countrymen from Japan to Harvard. And whenever there's an event in Tokyo with Susan, many of them appear and just say, "Arigatou gozaimasu, arigatou gozaimasu," and that's all you hear, thanking Susan for the generosity that she provided while they were in Cambridge. So with that, let me turn to the topic today, which will be, a panel will be chaired by all of our students. All 4 panelists have received PhDs at Harvard University, were mentees of Susan. And I'm going to introduce one by one. And we will have 4 speakers from around the world on various topics. So let me first introduce the first panelist, Margarita Estévez-Abe from Syracuse University. And she will speak on the topic of economic calculations of political participation in Japan, revisiting political women in Japan. So let me turn it over to Margarita. Now, beware, the first person who'll be asking the question after 4 people finishes, 4 of her students finish, will be Susan. So with that warning, let me turn over to Margarita. お願いします。
ありがとうございます。Okay, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. So Shin approached me asking me to make some presentation based on my research. But then I was just thinking, these days, political women in Japan, women in Japanese politics, how to increase the number of these women has been a very big topic in Japan. And also Susan's first book was on political women in Japan. The book was published in 1982, but she interviewed these women in the early 1970s. So I thought that maybe it's just very appropriate for today's occasion to revisit Susan's work in the context of the social transformations that have happened in Japan since the early 70s, and apply the insights from her work to understand what has happened to Japanese women in politics since 1990s. And I think this is very appropriate, just given the fact that Susan has followed very closely the progress of Japanese women, not only as an academic, but as a very close friend of numerous trend-blazing Japanese women who led the charge. As Christina already mentioned, Susan interviewed over 100 women in Japan during the 1971 and 72. She didn't interview with female politicians, because in those days there weren't that many of them. So instead, what she has done was to interview women who were politically engaged, women who volunteered, and then based on the interviews, just came up with a typology of political women in Japan. The biggest group that she found was what she calls new women. So these women who were educated, worked after they graduated from school, but were not feminists nor ideological. These women accepted the prevailing gender norms, but also just wanted to be engaged with the outside world beyond the confines of their home. Susan focused on these women because she thought that these women could potentially be agents of social change in Japan. So my question today is, did they change Japan? And in order to answer these questions, I want to just situate them within the social change, but also the labor market disadvantages that Japanese women still suffer today. So a very quick view of what has happened in the past 50 years, because this year's to 2021, and Susan started interviewing these women in 1971. Okay, so as you can see, Japan used to have a big agricultural sector, no longer, so the economy has changed. The number of women who just go on to 4-year colleges has dramatically expanded. There have been sort of changes in the marriage market behavior. Fewer people just get married today in Japan. Fertility rates has gone down. Mary Brinton would just know a lot about this. Despite the fact that so many more women go on to 4-year universities, what we see is that the female employment rate per se hasn't changed that much. Japan's low female employment rate has not gone unnoticed. Well, actually, Japan has gained international notoriety for being a very difficult place for women, both within the labor market and in politics. The figure on the right just shows, so the figure on the right is just something that's just often used when people just make a case about how there are so few women in Japanese politics. So this figure is the ratio of women in the lower house. But then the picture just gets more complicated. International comparisons of women in politics just tends to just use one parliamentary chamber. And in the case of Japan, that's lower house. So when we just look at that, Japan indeed just looks just very bad. But just let's look at these sort of different figures. So the figure on the left shows the historical shifts in the ratio of women in the upper house. And we just see that the numbers is quite different from the lower house. There was this big spike in 1989 election in terms of the number of female politicians elected. This was just typically just referred to as the Madonna boom. Because we don't have much time, I won't just go into the details. The figure in the middle shows the female ratio in different types of local elections. Here, I just want to just get your attention to the rise in the number of female politicians in local elections in urban areas, more specifically, the 23 special wards in Tokyo. Again, here we just see a big spike in 1999 local elections. This is just where the number of women in the local assembly increased dramatically. Just numerous scholars have written on the factors that affect the share of women in politics. Today, I don't have enough time to do justice to this debate, but just let me just state that when we just look at the intra-country variations within Japan, just some of the factors that are on this list become less relevant. for the sake of time today, I just want to highlight two things: that's economic calculations of people entering politics, and also the level of competition that might just affect the number of women. Now, okay, so going back to Susan's insight. So I just showed that in the local assembly elections in Tokyo's 23 wards, there was a big spike in the number of women in 1999. So this happened thanks to the new women, Susan's term, new women. So this spike was made possible by the new women. So these new women were just, so they were housewives, highly educated housewives in urban areas in Tokyo. So these women formed a new civic movement called Seikatsu Network Movement. And they just started fielding basically their members to various local elections. So, so this really was the harbinger of regular ordinary housewives just running for local office. Just prior to that, in urban areas, local female politicians tended to be mostly communist, from the Communist Party, or some from the Komeito Party. So economic calculations of these just netto women, typically called, were just simple. So these women, despite the fact that they were just highly educated, they all just became housewives, and they were all married to highly educated men who had good, secure jobs. And they were just all just invariably mothers, and they didn't work. So they just had ample time to get involved in local issues. So it's quite interesting that despite the fact that they were the first generation of women who just entered into local politics in Japan, their success wasn't just long lasting, because the social change that happened in Japan did two things. One, reduced the number of housewives, because women just started work, but also it just reduced the number of women who were married. So in a sense, the ranks of the number of new women who just fueled this netto movement, the supply just started to decrease. But this is the interesting thing, that although these urban housewives just may have declined in number, the continuing labor market disadvantages facing Japanese women just created other possibilities. And here I just want to talk about the rise of new women. So in Japan, the labor market disadvantages that women suffer mean that there's an abundant supply of highly educated, underutilized married women, especially in urban Japan. Just despite the fact that the employment, the Abe government has been just saying that the employment rate of women has gone, married women has gone up, but the increase has just mainly happened because just women have just taken on irregular job contracts, such as a part-time job. So I can't just go into the details. So despite the fact that there are more women who are attached to the labor market, they just continue to face family unfriendly Japanese corporate practices, which make them abandon their career, move with their husbands when their husbands just get posted abroad or other parts of Japan. So this means that the new women, so just to give you a quick idea of the contrast between new women and new women, just let me just introduce you to two real women. The first is Masako Ogawara. So she was one of the first netto women who were elected to the local assembly, then to the prefectural assembly, and then just moved up to the upper house. And currently she's a member of the lower house. So she was university educated, curious, politically aware, worked before marriage, but never worked after she got married. and she had 3 kids. And when she was mostly done with child rearing, she just became a candidate for the Seikatsu network movement. And it's interesting that when I had an opportunity to interview these women in the 1990s, and it was just curious that none of these women were concerned about public childcare policies. Mostly they were worried about how to care for their elderly parents. Fast forwarding to today, so we have a new women. So these new women, they are not radical feminists, but unlike Ogawara, the new women here, her name is Hiroko Yamamoto. So these new women have formed professional identities before becoming mothers. So she just ran for the local assembly position in Meguro ward twice, very successfully. And she just ran as an IT engineer with 3 children. So we already just see a big sort of transformation here between the Ogawara's time and today's Japan. And she was ambitious enough to run for the mayoral race in Meguro. But then it's another thing that I just want to highlight is that so when she lost the mayoral bid, she just went back to work as an IT engineer again. And here's the thing, that because Japanese women are disadvantaged in the labor market, even the ones who just want to build careers, they have to factor in that their careers might be interrupted for major family events. So many of the women just build careers that can overcome those family events. So in her case, as an IT engineer, highly sought after work. So she has a very flexible skill sets, unlike men who just go into big corporations and invest in firm specific skills. So, and this just matters because here's the economics of running for office. Just politics is a very risky career decision to make. Especially if you are a corporate man in Japan, it's almost impossible for you to quit your work and run for office. In Japan's highly segmented labor market, all good jobs sort of captured into the inside labor market. Once you leave it, it's hard to get back in. There are changes that are happening, but still, Japanese labor market is just nothing like the American labor market. Despite the fact that ordinary Japanese men might just find it difficult to enter politics, the calculations are different for Japanese women. And also let's just look at in just thinking about the economics of running for office, there's a whole number of factors that we have to take into consideration. Again, because we don't have just too much time, let me just show you this slide to just sort of give a sense of the economic remuneration that Japanese politicians get. So in prefectural levels, the pay is not that bad. The pay actually is quite good for women who just find it difficult to make high salary, just relative to men. And once we get to the diet, Japanese politicians are extremely well remunerated. So because of women's disadvantages in the labor market, so my argument is that today it's easier for underutilized, highly educated women to seek public office at the local level. And not only that, there are also underutilized elite women who might just consider going into politics. And it's quite interesting that the more competitive elections become, the greater the number of women, and especially not only in the urban areas, but even when we just look at the single member districts in Japan, political scientists have argued that single member districts gender biased against women. So there's almost like a consensus among political scientists that women just tend to do better in countries that adopt a PR system. Well, it turns out that when we just look at the upper house, women have done just quite well in single member districts. And overall, even in the single member districts in the lower house, novice female candidates have had the much higher odds of winning their seats. So it's interesting that despite the fact that we just think that the Japanese system is just set up against, Japanese political system is set up against women, once women are fielded, they have just proved to be very competitive. Because when we just compare the male supply and female supply of candidates, the kind of high quality human capital, when it's just female, because it's just being squeezed out of the labor market, they have a lower, in terms of economic incentives, they are more open. The risk of political career is less for women than for men. So in closing, I want to say that, well, paradoxically, as far as the labor market sort of squeezes high-skilled women, when this is combined with increase in competitiveness of elections, we might just see an opening of a further increase in Japanese female candidates, even in the absence of a strictly enforced quota. So let me end here. Thank you very much.
Hiro, we can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for going back to Susan's first book, Political Women in Japan. And we will probably hear from Susan on this topic later. But let me turn next to another academic in the political science department at University of Tokyo, and another student of Susan's, Rieko Kage, who will make a presentation on voter responses to female candidates' voice pitch, experimental evidence from Japan. So, Rieko, お願いします。
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much. I'm just going to quickly share my slides.
Okay.
Can you see this? Great, thank you. As with Margarita, when I was asked to make this presentation today, I thought it would be appropriate to make a presentation on women in Japan, given that, as Margarita mentioned, Susan's first book was Political Women in Japan. Also, perhaps one of Susan's best known pieces of work, and Christina alluded to earlier, is about tea pourers and their rebellion in Japan, and how tea pourers made their views known in an often unhospitable environment. And so I thought I would present a recent piece of research that I've begun in collaboration with Frances Rosenbluth at Yale University and Seiki Tanaka, who is at Groningen University, which also deals with the issue of how women in Japan make themselves heard, and perhaps in a more literal way. And this is about voice pitch of female candidates. We know very well from existing research that voters are responsive to political candidates' nonverbal cues. And perhaps the best known of these is that American voters favor taller presidential candidates than shorter presidential candidates. But height is not the only nonverbal cue that voters respond to. It is known that voters care about quote unquote facial attractiveness of political candidates, and that can influence their voting behavior, also their attire as well. And the focus of this research is female candidates' voice pitch. As Margarita mentioned, and she showed you much more elaborate detailed graphs, so I won't go into detail today. There is still underrepresentation of female legislators. Also, Japanese women are known to speak at relatively high pitch levels compared to those of many Western countries. And there are actually not very many systematic comparative studies that have been done on this. But according to a 1995 study, Japanese young women typically speak at about 232 hertz, about 20 hertz higher than American women, which in turn are 20 hertz higher than Swedish women. According to linguists, this is in part driven by language. Speakers of Japanese and Chinese, for instance, are known to speak at higher pitch levels than speakers of Western language. But the purpose of this particular research is not so much to go into the determinants of different pitch levels among women of different countries, but in examining the effects of pitch levels. There have been a number of studies that have been conducted on how pitch levels impact voter attitudes. Work by Casey Klostad on American voters and Yosuke Okada on Japanese voters. Show that voters both in the US and Japan prefer female candidates with lower voice pitch rather than those with higher voice pitch. And this is also consistent with studies in the field of social psychology that show lower pitch to be often associated with assessments of competence, hierarchical rank, and strength, among other things. But we know less about how preferences for female candidates with higher or lower pitch levels differ across different segments of the population. In terms of hypotheses, we take as our starting point the finding by Syracuse and others that show lower pitch voice is often being viewed by the public as being more professional. So for instance, even experts have been found to lower their pitch levels when they are being asked for advice, for instance. So we take this low level of pitch as being symbolic of liberation from traditional female gender norms, which leads us to hypothesize female voters to be more favorable of low-pitched female candidates and male voters, and also younger voters to be more favorable towards low-pitched female candidates and older voters. And in fact, we know that younger female voters today typically speak at lower pitch levels than younger Japanese females did 20 or 30 years ago. So we went about to test these hypotheses and just this past March with the survey company Rakuten INSEAD with a sample size of just under 700. Because this study was conducted as part of a different study, our age group, the age group for our respondents is somewhat truncated. We only have respondents between 20 and 50. And also for the same reason, we have an oversampling of female respondents, although we will be adjusting for that in the findings that we will be showing you. The sample does approximate the national census in terms of geographic location. What we did in our survey was that we went about splitting the 699 respondents randomly into 4 treatment groups. And what we did was we had all of the respondents listen to a 45-second recording by what we informed them was a 45-year-old female politician. And half of the respondents were given the recording of a speech, at the original pitch level, which on this slide is shown as the low pitch level. And the pitch levels ranged between 130 and 330 hertz. Because we were working with a linguist, and we were also able to manipulate the recording so that we raised the same recording, but just by 50 hertz. So respondents were given the same speech, but only 50 hertz higher in terms of pitch. Also, half of the respondents were informed that this recording was by a one-term relatively inexperienced political candidates. The remaining half was told that this speech was by a 5-term, relatively experienced candidate. After giving them the recording, we asked the respondents whether they would vote for this candidate, assuming that she is running for office in their electoral district for the party that they support. Just to give you an overview of the findings, we actually found the highest levels of support for the low-pitched experienced, i.e. 5-term candidate, and the lowest levels of support for the low-pitched inexperienced, i.e. 1-term candidate. Although the difference between the levels of support, the willingness to vote for these candidates was not very large. But when we split up the responses by gender, the differences actually are quite marked, and especially for the low-pitched 5-term candidate. And then we went about testing whether these differences are in fact statistically significant for each of the treatment groups. And then in fact, when we add the covariates, education, age, and income, it turns out that the only statistically significant difference is for the low-pitched experienced candidate, the 5-term candidate. And the remaining 3 treatment groups, the differences actually are not statistically significant. When we collapse the 2 graphs on the right-hand side together, the treatment groups on the right-hand side together, we still find that gender is significant. So men are actually more likely to favor low-pitched female candidates than women, which was actually quite contrary to our initial expectations. And we aren't quite sure why that is. It really leads to the question of mechanisms. It is possible that perhaps women and men have different views of representation. Perhaps men are looking for female candidates that are more professional, more authoritative, while women may be looking for candidates that are perhaps more like them, but we still don't know, and this will be tested further in the next round of surveys that we will be conducting. Also, contrary to our expectations, we did not find any effect of age, although again, our sample only included respondents up to age 50. So again, in the next round, we will be testing the hypotheses on the full range of age groups. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I should go with a low pitch voice with experience, but that's very interesting findings. Thank you, Rieko. So we turn to our 3rd student and speaker, who's also in the political arena, teaching at Seoul National University, Graduate Studies of International Studies. And her presentation is on Japan's labor market and social welfare policies under the pressure of demographic challenges. So Jiyeoun Song is reporting from Seoul. So it must be like 11 p.m. your time as well, or around that time?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us so late in the evening. So Jiyeoun, please present your slides.
Thank you. Can you see my slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much for very nice introduction, and it is great honor and pleasure to attend this symposium for Susan. So I arrived in Harvard in actually 2001, so which means 20 years ago. So it's kind of how I can explain my kind of feeling. So I has been just the student of Susan for last 2 decades, and now it's time for her retirement. So it's kind of so emotional and touching. At the same time, when I just asked to present my research, I was thinking about what I'm going to do. And I thought my research interest about the labor market, actually, it just evolved from Susan's class when I'm taking her civil society class. So when I prepared for her paper, term paper, I was thinking with, okay, Susan, can I just write a paper on the labor unions? Are they civil society? And Susan was very kind of supportive. So why not? So just do work. So this was my first starting point to study on labor market and more extension with all the issues, what I'm working on. So today I'm going to briefly share what I'm working for the past kind of years or so. And it will be a very nice kind of complement to what Margarita and Rieko mentioned about, because I am talking about labor market at the same time. I touch upon some kind of gender issue, especially a women's labor market issue. So as everyone knows, Japan has been challenging severe demographic challenges, which is identified as the decline fertility rate and also our aging society. Of course, this is not an issue only for Japan. It has been a common problem for most advanced Indian societies. However, the most serious issue about Japan's case is the speed of the demographic challenges. So as you can see from this kind of slide, I just showed it at some the turning point. So Japan has been just entered the aging society, which is the 7.1% of the 65 years old elderly population, and then past its another threshold is aging society. And right now, Japan is, as of 2019, almost 1/3 of the population, they are elderly over 65 years old, which is the eldest society in the world. So the next Japan, Germany and Italy, but they're still 21 or 20%. So they are rapidly aging, but not as fast as Japan's case. And at the same time, Japan is facing very rapid decline of the population. So according to Japan's census, Japan already entered the stage of declining population. So according to population projections, actually it is by 2050, Japan's population is expected to be 101.923 million. So which means people are concerned about the declining population. At the same time, in labor market-wise, Japan's post-war baby boom generation, which Dankai no Serai, they already exit from the labor market in the 2010s, which means they are kind of pensioners. So which means Japanese government, Japanese society have to pay for all the pension benefits for the elderly population. The speed of aging is so fast. So of course, this kind of aging population has not a big issue if we have many number of babies, but as everyone knows, but Japan also faced the severe decline fertility rates. So population replacement rate is 2.1, but Japan is already under the death stage by the mid-1970s. And right now, it's kind of 1.36. So even if Japan's government is trying to reverse this trend, actually it has been working that much. So based on this population change, what I'm interested about the more labor market consequences. So everyone knows Japan is very rapidly aging, which means we are facing declining number of working age population, which is identified as the people between 15 years old and 64 years old. So they are most actively participating in the labor market and they are more productive in a way. However, Japan has been declining these numbers. And the other one is at the same time, so it's Japan's job to applicant ratio, which means how many jobs are available compared with the number of the job applicants. So as you can see from here, I just put the number from the 2011 up to 2019. So over the past decade in particular, Japanese labor market suffered from severe labor shortages. So especially not only for the just total workers, but regular workers who are more guaranteed of job security and decent wages and welfare benefits, they are also kind of labor shortages. So Japanese society in general, they are talking about the labor shortage issue. So this is quite a similar picture, especially small and medium enterprises. Usually they are suffering from more labor shortage than large size firms, especially those in rural area. So under these situations, what is the main challenges? So of course, the Japanese government has been trying to improve all this situation. So one of the major targets was mobilizing more people in the labor market. So just going back to the Abenomics, they are in the first stage of Abenomics, we call the 3 arrows announced in January 2013. So the first target of Abenomics mostly focusing on economic revitalization. So well known as aggressive monetary policy, flexible fiscal policy, and also growth strategy, including structural reforms. However, the Abe government actually shifted its strategy toward a different direction. Of course, it put the strong economy as top priority, as putting GDP target of 600 trillion yen. However, interestingly, the conservative Abe government, they propose the second goal as the support for child rearing, and the third one is various social reform, especially for the elderly care. So which is, and on the one hand, it's a labor market, on the one hand, economic revitalization policy, but at the same time, the second part of Abenomics is more combination with economic policy and social policy. So in that context, people might be puzzled why the government is trying to put emphasis on these kind of social policies as a way of revitalizing economy. So there are many explanations, but one of the main argument is without a stable supply of good workforce, actually this sustainable growth is not going to be possible. So the Abe government is trying to push more labor market policy as a way of mobilizing more people. So focusing on the second stage of Abenomics, so in particular, Abe government is trying to propose many kind of slogans and policies, mobilizing more workforce. So many of you already heard about the womanomics, which is nicely mentioned by the Margarita and the Rieko earlier about the mobilizing more women in the labor market. So Japanese women, despite of their high level education, but still Japanese women's labor market participation or employment rates are not as high as those of advanced industry countries. So Abe government consider mobilizing means activating these women to participate in labor market, which might solve some problem labor shortages. And the other one is not only women, but they just propose Ichioku's Sokatsu Yaku. So all 100 million playing an active role, which is trying to mobilize not only just women, but elderly or young people as a way of activating more people in the labor market. And third one is hataraki kata kaikak, which is work style reform. This is another way of to mobilize more people. So they are trying to, as I mentioned, as policy tools, by proposing all these issues, especially work style reform, the Abe government is trying to introduce diverse and flexible employment working conditions. And also by doing so, they allowed more women, they can balance work and life. And some elders, they can also participate in labor market, just taking into account their health condition or some other considerations. And also by reducing long work hours, so they allowed more families to balance work and life, and offering more child care and elder care. That's another way of the work-life balance. So by doing so, the Abe government was trying to mobilize more inactive population to the labor market. And this is the first part, more mobilizing people. At the same time, the Abe government was also trying to reduce the gap between regular workers and non-regular workers. So Japanese labor market has been well known for labor market dualism, which is a clear the huge difference between regular workers or non-regular workers depending on their employment status or firm size or even gender or age. So by just trying to reducing this gap, the government is trying to have more opportunity for many women, youth, they enter the labor market. So the bottom line is, on the facing of all these labor shortages, the Abe government is trying to activate more Japanese workers in the labor market. So primary target is young, old, and female workers, because Japanese males, they already have pretty high percentage of labor market participation and employment rates. So however, the government is trying to mobilize more Japanese workers. However, at some point, these kind of mobilization strategies have not been that effective. Of course, it just allowed more women to participate in the labor market, but these women, mostly they are working in the service sector job and more part-time job, like in a supermarket or some other retail stores. But many industries, they suffer from the more labor shortages. It's more manufacturing sectors, agriculture sectors, and based in rural area. So the issue is, even if the government is trying to activate more Japanese workers in the labor market, but it didn't that much effective as as much as what government wanted to do. So what happened in Japan's labor market was that Japan's government in 2018, December 2018, tried to allow more foreign workers to enter the Japanese labor market. So governments revised Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act in December 2018. So expecting to have almost foreign workers in 5 years, especially targeting 14 industrial sectors suffering from severe labor shortages, Japanese government tried to open more doors widely than previous kind of years. Of course, Japanese companies and Japanese government, they allowed foreign workers, industrial trainees or some other types of workers. However, this is more kind of official kind of the turning point of Japanese foreign worker policy, because they allowed, first of all, foreign workers to enter the labor market and also allow them to stay much longer. And then they just allowed for the, there are two different types. One is category 1 and category 2. So some skills with category 1 and more advanced skills to category 2. So by doing so, government's trying to provide more opportunity for foreign workers to come in. And this was more recent changes. The Japanese government also trying to encourage more elderly to stay longer. So as I just mentioned earlier, Japan is facing very rapid speed of aging, which means they need to make either elderly work longer, or they need to put more the welfare reform, either pensions or other healthcare. So the government proposed the revision of the Stabilization Employment Old Persons Act, effective as the last April. So allow elderly they can stay up to 7 years old, but it's not really legally binding, but it's kind of the company's effort. But at this point, the government has tried to encourage more elderly population to participate in staying in the labor market, but it is expected to push another pension reform, which means the postpone the pensionable age up to 70 years old is no later. So related to this issue, so in labor market, government is trying to boost more workforce in the labor market, but at the same time, welfare policy-wise, government is trying to maintain fiscal stability, especially pension and healthcare reform. As I mentioned earlier, Japan is facing very rapid speed of aging, so it's very important to maintain the fiscal stability. At the same time, Japanese labor market, there have been huge gap between regular workers and non-regular workers. So most of the part-time workers and regular workers, they are excluded from the pension and also the employment insurance program. So government is trying to expand the social safety net to these people, kind of new, non-traditional kind of workers. Finally, the government also trying to respond to so-called new social risk. So which means all these demographic challenges and more women's participation in labor market, so which triggered another demand for new policies, for example, childcare or elder care. So in Japan's case, mostly elder care has been a big issue. So by doing so, government should be trying to respond to all these demographic challenges over the past few decades. So finally, the Japanese government has been trying to cope with all these new demographic challenges. So as usual, they have been trying to reversing the trend of declining fertility rates by offering more policy support and also work-life balance policies. At the same time, by activating more workers, women, young and elderly workers. By doing so, they wanted to boost more labor force participation rate. And recently, they also tried to open more doors widely for foreigners. Of course, they are always trying to increase labor productivity, which is a top priority. So labor market reform and technology innovation. However, this kind of policy has been just implemented for the past few decades or so. So the question is there any new solution for us? So this is, of course, not only for Japan's cases, but Japan is one of the eldest society in the world. So as Japan can just offer some new policy solutions or some experiment, it can give good reference cases for other countries that might face the similar problems in the near future. So, okay, thank you so much for attending my presentation. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiyeoun. Yeah, I'm sure Susan will have a comment or two on your analysis on the social welfare side of the democratic challenge. Thank you so much.
Takeuchi Sensei, there's Michael Witt is the final presenter.
Okay, I'm sorry, my mic was muted. Michael is going to be our final speaker. He is he is from INSEAD, and I think he's works for the strategy and international business side of INSEAD, Singapore, and his presentation is entitled Japan and Varieties of Capitalism, a very, very popular topic these days. So with that, Michael, you're on.
Okay, thank you so very much for the kind introduction. Now, in the interest of time, I'll try to be brief. So first of all, thank you so very much for inviting me to this symposium. I was pleasantly surprised because if Susan is keeping a list of Mondaiji among her advisees, I'm fairly sure I rank pretty highly on it. So anyway, here I am. I got invited. Thank you so very much. And I was thinking about what my presentation should be regarding to, and then it struck me I probably should not talk about my research because, after all, some of you have a 9-hour symposium ahead of you, and you need to remain conscious. So I decided to go actually with something that Susan in general likes to ask people, namely, what is the larger meaning of this? I think those of us who have experienced Susan at seminars will know that this is one of her favorite questions. And I actually thought maybe I should actually speak about something that I know quite a bit about, namely varieties of capitalism, and raise the question basically, what can we still learn from Japan within varieties of capitalism? And you can see how Susan's question comes in as I proceed. So, I mean, obviously, we know a lot about varieties of capitalism in Japan. I mean, people have been looking at the place for a very, very long time. And of course, we have had a range of classifications over time. So Ron Dorr in 2000 basically described it as welfare capitalism, which roughly translated to it's kind of like Germany. Right? Then Hall and Soskis in 2001 in Varieties of Capitalism described it as a coordinated market economy, which translates to it's roughly like Germany. And then in 2013, Gordon Redding and I actually drew on the Oxford Handbook of Asian Business Systems, which we had just edited, did an analysis of basically how Japan lined up relative to Western, major Western economies and Asia. And we found that Japan is kind of like Germany. Quite literally, it actually is intriguing. Japan was the only Asian country to cluster with Western economies, and it clustered with Sweden and Germany. Now, in 2018, we expanded this sample to include 94% of world GDP because we were interested in what are world varieties of capitalism. And the expectation was that Japan would be kind of like Germany. And funny enough, that's not what happened. So it actually turns out with more up-to-date data, more comprehensive data, and a larger sample, Japan clusters as a unique case. And I was thinking to myself, that's just fantastic, right? That's just what Japan needs to be told that it is unique. Okay, anyway, here we are. You can see it here at the bottom right here. Okay, Japan basically, it kind of clusters with Germany, all right, but fundamentally it's basically its own case. And at this point, you have to say, well, this is all nice, right? And people have now spent decades trying to figure out the institutional structure of Japan. And as a matter of fact, it is probably one of the best explored institutional structures that we have in the world. So we're done, right? It's tempting to say that. And you would also say it's like, plus it's a case of its own, right? So, I mean, what's really the point of studying that all that much, right? I mean, what can we learn from that? But then there's some intriguing features as well. Namely, it turns out this unique system actually doesn't perform well. It just doesn't, right? So basically, ultimately, the question of an economic system, if you want to ask it, is, sure, I mean, you know, do people support it? It's the political side. But economically speaking, the question is, for what you put into it, what do you get out of it? And at least in terms of work, in terms of labor, you see that Japan gets refreshingly little out of it, right? What I'm showing you here is how much GDP do these countries actually produce per hour worked, and with all the things such as price differences and so on and so forth actually taking out of the equation. And you can see France does surprisingly well. I'm from INSEAD, so I have the right to make fun of France. And I can say, you know, obviously we always say it's amazing, you know, obviously the French could produce something if we only could get them to work. Then the US is doing relatively well, Germany, okay, UK, well, not so great. And Japan actually looks pretty bad. And you say, at least it's beating Korea. But then we all know that Japanese companies completely, grossly underreport the working hours of their workers. Right? According to OECD statistics, actually Japanese work less than Americans. And I'm not really sure how many people actually really believe that. So if we take more realistic working hour assumptions, actually Japan probably even trails Korea. So translation, for all the effort that goes into it, it doesn't produce enough. And you can say that's great, but anyway, it's a nice stable system. Maybe people are happy with it and so on and so forth. But, you know, then we've already heard this alluded to. Jiyeoun basically was talking about population decline. I'll show you here the results of a prediction or a forecast that appeared last year in the Lancet, namely the question of where would populations actually be in 2100. Okay. And you can see France will grow, US will grow, Germany will drop, but actually by not that much. UK will grow, but Japan will actually drop by 53%, beating even Korea. This is probably the largest drop other than maybe Taiwan. I think Taiwan has a bigger drop than that. So here we have a variety of capitalism that doesn't produce enough value for the stuff that it puts in, and it is literally on the way to extinction. And of course, as Margarita has also pointed out, there's reasons for that. And part of that is because Japan is basically a rotten place if you're a woman and you want to have a career. Okay, so here you have the glass ceiling index, and you can look for any index that you actually want. Here in this particular case, Japan actually beats Korea for last place. It turns out the different index, the gender gap index, essentially reverses that. And coming out ahead, just ahead of Sierra Leone, is not really a badge of honor. So it's great, maybe that Japan then gets really good women going into politics, but, you know, honestly, I'm not really sure that this is a particularly good sign for the survivability of this particular system. And of course, all of these data are public. And the fun part is, even though this is public, and even though the writing is on the wall, it's not changing. And of course, you can say, yes, of course it's changing. That's not the kind of change that I mean, right? I mean, of course, you know, it's like, you know, any second, everybody, anything is changing. I'm not the same as I was a second before, right? But I'm still me. Similarly, Japan, funny enough, doesn't seem to be kind of adjusting all that much to things. So what I show you here is something, this is a summary of a very long empirical analysis in my 2006 book. And effectively, I mean, I just put it there for historical value, if you will. This is very high level, but I'm really hard pressed to find places where we could say this is no longer true today. So I know Japanese speak of, you know, the boiled frog, right? And but, you know, as a scientist, the question then becomes, okay, what's the point of looking at the system? I mean, if anything, this basically spells out stasis. And then I was thinking about Susan's question. What does it mean? Take it to a higher level. What does this signify? And I think this is actually something where really in the field of looking at Japan, and I don't mean Japanese studies. I think Japan has to contribute so much more to a wider variety of areas where I think we still have something that we can contribute. And I think, and I maintain, and I know some of you may not agree, but I think still that Japan is the perfect place for studying systemic non-transformation. So actually the opposite of what the topic for this panel was, I mean, basically, there's a lot of inertia, and lots of people have written on this. Marjan Robbins, basically about symbolic adoption of things. Marie-Anne Duguy on the role of culture. Ron Doerr, this chapter is fantastic in the book by Aoki Jackson Miyajima on corporate governance, where basically in one chapter, Ron Doerr destroys the rest of the book, right? Because everybody else talks about structural changes, and Ron Doerr said, but the real practice has not changed. Right. And obviously, I also wrote about this and fundamentally writing how social capital, which can be a source of resilience, and Dan Aldrich will talk about that, actually arguably is also a source of inertia and inability to adjust. So to me, it seems this is not it. Recently, I was doing a little bit of research with a colleague. We don't have quite the data yet to show this, but we're looking at why, or basically who gets adopted or who gets appointed to Japanese boards as a woman. And it seemed to us that basically Japanese boards intentionally actually appoint female directors that have no chance of influencing the board. There could be an interesting mechanism that might actually be a nice contribution to, shall we say, sociology more general, or perhaps also political science, the question of institutional change. And I'm just giving you this as one example. I think we are not done yet trying to figure out, how you can actually have structural inertia in a system. And I think Japan is a wide open field for that. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be much, much more kind of involved than the early works that I'm citing there, because I would expect complex causality with interdependencies among multiple systems, equifinality, multiple pathways leading to similar outcomes, and of course causal asymmetry, where the presence of something that, or a factor that leads to the presence of a certain outcome, then the opposite of that factor being present does not necessarily lead to the absence of that outcome. So I think there's great stuff to be done with qualitative work, elucidating the mechanisms at work, and also set theoretical methods such as FSQCA for finding these complex causal patterns. And just as a closing thought, even if these mechanisms do not generalize to other contexts, so this is the question of the uniqueness, I think, in terms of a theoretical contribution, there is definitely space for this one to occur here. And with that, I'm out of time, and I would like to say thank you so very much for having me here. Susan, happy retirement.
Thank you, Michael. We heard from 4 of Susan's mentees, students, scattered around the world on various topics. I've been advised to ask Susan for the first comment or question in order to start the discussion. Unfortunately, I'm against a time limit of 10:30 a.m. your time, which is in about 7 minutes. We may not start a discussion, but I would dearly love to hear what Susan has to say, because this is the first panel, and there will be other panels following this. And I think, there's enough food on the table that we can digest later on. So with that, let me turn to Susan for her, not only the first comment, but maybe the only comment of the panel. So Susan, the 7 minutes is yours.
Well, needless to say, I'm feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the very warm-hearted comments that speakers so far have made. And I can't tell you what a joy it is to see all of you who are in such different parts of the world all together, and how frustrating it is through Zoom that we can't sort of actually be in the same room together and talk. But let me just say, pose just a few questions. And I'll start with Michael because his presentation is somewhat different. But Michael, I completely understand the arguments you're making. You're saying Japan is unique and that Japan in today, you say, is a poor performer. But think about the other side of this. Part of this, is it not, due to the fact that Japan has made a commitment to keeping a fairly large percentage of its workforce still in secure jobs with benefits? It would be an easy way to liberalize Japan by having more and more marginal workers, and then we would end up with a situation as we have in the United States, with people working multiple jobs but without benefits. So hasn't Japan, from another standpoint, actually made a choice with a certain wisdom in it to protect basically its citizens through the particular workforce formulation that they have come up with? For the other panelists, which do convene and come around a topic that's been so important in my own thinking and work, and as a person, as a woman, the puzzle of Japan, of why it is that there are not more women in politics. That Japan rates in its terms of its women in the Diet 165th in the world, despite the high levels of education and so on. And in my own work, I was trying to say, in terms of the implications for the discussion today, I was saying that there was a prior problem for women, that they had to cope with their role ideology, how they saw their place in relation to their partner in life, in relation to their family, and to even free themselves to be involved in politics, they had to overcome the obstacles of role ideology. Today, we've talked about a lot of ways in which actually it should be that the pool of women to go into politics should just be growing and growing. After all, immigration has been constrained, so rivalry in terms of foreigners coming in has been held in check in some ways. So women in the pool, there should be more and more women in the pool. And Jiyeoun talked about the many kinds of policy initiatives trying to deal with fertility that benefit women and free them up. That is parental leave and reducing the working hours, more flexible time. Some of these reforms today should be increasing the pool of women to go into politics. But in the end, I guess in my own thinking, I focus more and more on what it is in terms of the structural barriers that keep women from getting chosen as candidates and winning elections. So I'd just be interested in what you say about this. And just quickly for Rieko, I have a particular question about high voices. When you're in a Japanese home, it is an extraordinary thing to listen to Japanese women talk in a lower register and answer the phone and go up an octave in answering the phone. And in drama school, we know that actresses are taught to lower their register. So what I would want to know is, it may be true that males like women politicians with low voices, but what kind of voices do they prefer in their partners? So I'll stop there because we have to give you a chance to reply. So my question really is, what keeps party brokers, and speaking now really of the LDP, from choosing women as candidates when all around the world, political brokers want fresh faces and women are an obvious source of excellent candidates, and yet they aren't getting chosen in seats they can win?
In what order would you like us to go? You need to unmute yourself.
Well, okay, Michael, why don't you, yours is a little different, so go ahead.
I give you the 15-second answer. Susan, great question, absolutely valid point, but they don't need to go the way of the US. I mean, the US is clearly not a very successful model, right? And I would say life in much of northern parts of continental Europe is pretty good, and those systems perform better. So it's not basically, it's not a binary choice.
Okay.
So Jiyeoun, next about the reforms today should be increasing the pool of women in politics. Comment from Susan.
The pool
Well,
eligible to be in politics.
Okay, Susan, thank you so much for your very nice and thoughtful comments. So, as you mentioned, I cannot think of any kind of at this point the structural kind of barriers, but at the same time, I think all this kind of the employment policy to balance work and life, it just allows some room for women to actually think about they can just participate in the political life as well. But at the same time, over the past few decades or so, despite all this government policy, actually, there has been huge kind of improvement in a sense. So it might be, we might think of another way of either institutional support or some other way of boosting female candidates, politicians in the field. So that's my kind of short comments on your kind of thought, but I will think about that issue. What will be more structural barrier for women to just participate in more the political world? Thank you, Susan.
Okay, let me turn to Rieko. It was very interesting. The switch in the phone when picking up the phone. So the question was, what voice level do the partners really prefer? Any comment on that, Rieko?
Sure. I mean, thank you for your question, Susan and Professor Takeuchi. And it's really interesting that you point that out, because I think I do that myself and I don't even think about it. But about your question about what voice pitch do men in Japan prefer in their partners, that there are studies that have been done about, and I think the really interesting finding there is that in the partners, men prefer high-pitched women, but when they vote, and according to our survey, they seem to prefer low-pitched women. So they seem to have different standards for assessing their partners and politicians. So
okay,
thank you so much.
So final comment from Margarita. Party brokers want fresh faces. Why not women?
I think Susan's question also just was that the parties were just giving safer seats to men. Well, I think that's really changing. I think it's really a function of the overall sort of competitiveness of the race. Because novice female candidates in districts have, even in lower house, have a better chance of winning than male novices. So in the lower house, when we just look at the upper house, there are more women. So in the lower house, I think that the way in which the electoral system is used protects male insiders. The fact that the single member district candidates are also listed in PR, that has the effect of protecting incumbents who are just more men. So I think that's delaying the change. But once they are once the LDP faces more competition and loses Kometo's electoral help, they will have to recruit more women.
Okay, final comment from Susan after hearing their responses?
No, to keep us on, just thank you all, and thank you, Hiro, for sharing.
Okay, well, this is a great start. We have lots to follow. I think, let me pick up just one point that Jiyeoun mentioned. We talk so much about hataraki kata kaikaku these days. You read about it in the newspapers every day. And I've been proposing to change one word in there, which is hataraki kata, which can also mean people, but call it hataraki bito kaikaku. So I'm,
you better explain that. You better explain that to non-Japanese speakers.
Okay. So I'm from the business school, and this is a challenge for a lot of the Japanese businesses because the hataraki kata kaikaku is, how do we change the way of working? And the kata, the kanji for kata can mean people, but I am of the opinion that it's probably more fundamental to do kataraki bito kaikaku, hito, because the underutilized resource in Japan are women, right? We all agree to that. Two, we need to do digitization, and young people are unfairly treated, in my opinion. So they are the underutilized resource. And maybe two more, right? People like me, the elderly, as well as foreign workers. So maybe, the kaikaku we need, the reform we need is not only about, working conditions or workplace, but really about who, with the emphasis on women and younger people especially, and secondarily on the elderly as well as non-Japanese workers. So this is a great start. Thank you so much. We are only over by 5 minutes. So by Japanese standard, that's a no-no, but let me tell you, by Harvard Business School standard, that's pretty good. So let me turn it over to Christina. Thank you so much for letting us have this panel.
But thank you very much for hosting, and to our panelists for excellent presentations. And of course, Susan, as always, great commentary. We welcome your joining us again at 2 o'clock for the next round of panels, and we'll let our guests in East Asia go to bed. Thank you for joining us late into the night. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.